Picture this. The wealthiest man in America builds himself a house, 64 rooms, an entire acre of private garden in the middle of Manhattan. Technology so advanced it wouldn't be matched for decades. And he calls it modest. Fast forward 20 years, and nobody knows what to do with it. The mansion becomes a burden, shuffled between institutions, nearly demolished, saved at the last minute by pure coincidence. This is the story of how Andrew Carnegie's dream home went from steel palace to white elephant, and how close we came to losing one of New York's grandest mansions forever. Going north, in 1898, Andrew Carnegie made a decision that his fellow millionaires thought was absolutely insane. The man who controlled America's steel industry, who could afford to live anywhere in New York City, decided to buy property at 91st Street and 5th Avenue. To understand just how crazy this was, you need to know that fashionable New York in 1898 clustered around the 50s and 60s. The other robber barons were building their French chateaux and Italian palazzos downtown, competing to see who could build the most ostentatious palace. Carnegie? He went to what was essentially the middle of nowhere. His peers thought he'd lost his mind. Going all the way up to 91st Street wasn't just unconventional, it was practically suburban. The neighbourhood was undeveloped, remote, far from the centres of power in society. But Carnegie had his reasons, and they weren't about showing off. He wanted space, real space, room for his wife Louise and their infant daughter Margaret to breathe, a garden where a child could actually play. And in 1890s Manhattan, getting that kind of space meant going where nobody else wanted to be. Carnegie quietly purchased 1.2 acres of land, paying what seemed like an absurd price for property that most people considered worthless. Then he did something even stranger. He started buying up the lots around his property too, not to build on them, not to flip them for profit. He bought them so he could control exactly who his neighbours would be. Carnegie was creating his own neighbourhood from scratch, handpicking who would be allowed to live near him. He'd resell the parcels, but only to people who agreed to build mansions that met his standards. If you weren't up to snuff, you weren't welcome in Carnegie's new neighbourhood. The architectural firm of Babb, Cook and Willard won the commission after a competition. Carnegie gave them instructions that sound humble until you actually think about them. He wanted the most modest, plainest and most roomy house in New York. Modest, plain, roomy. Remember those words, because what actually got built makes them sound like a punchline. Construction began in 1899. Carnegie was involved in every detail, constantly requesting revisions, driving the architects crazy, mediating disputes through his landscape architect Howard Russell Butler. Louise Carnegie took charge of many design decisions, adding a winter garden, a playroom, a nursery for Margaret. Carnegie himself focused on what he cared about most, the technology. This wasn't going to be just another mansion. This was going to be an engineering marvel. The mansion that rose on that property between 1899 and 1902 measured 56,368 square feet of living space. That's not a house, that's practically a city block, Georgian revival in style, designed to look like an English country house, which made sense given Carnegie's Scottish background and his love affair with Britain. But calling it modest was like calling the Titanic a boat, technically accurate, wildly misleading. The exterior might have looked restrained compared to some of the gilded monstrosities going up downtown, but step inside and you'd find a different story entirely. The main hall featured a 3,000 pipe organ made by Aeolian Skinner. Not a piano, not a small organ. 3,000 pipes. The kind of organ you'd find in a cathedral. Carnegie had initially budgeted $16,000 for it, but kept requesting alterations and improvements until the price ballooned far beyond the original estimate. Multiple libraries, because apparently one library wasn't enough for a modest house. A breakfast room that could seat dozens. a drawing room decorated in Louis XV style, and Scottish touches everywhere you looked. Bagpipes carved into the gilt details of the music room, thistle motifs on practically every surface, acorns carved into the woodwork, symbols of the self-made man. Carnegie wanted everyone to know where he came from and what he'd achieved. But here's where it gets interesting. Carnegie wasn't just building big. He was building smart, using the same engineering principles that had made him rich. This mansion became the first private residence in the United States to use structural steel frame construction. The man literally built his house the same way he'd built his fortune. He was living inside his own product, proving that steel construction wasn't just for bridges and office buildings. The technology inside was decades ahead of its time. Multiple electric Otis elevators, making it one of the first homes in New York with that kind of luxury. The air conditioning system was so sophisticated it could heat, cool, and humidify individual rooms independently. In 1902, that was practically magic. A fully electrified laundry room. And perhaps most impressive, a miniature train track in the basement with a coal car that could travel from the storage bin to enormous twin Babcock and Wilcox boilers, each capable of carrying 200 pounds of steam pressure. Carnegie being Carnegie, he installed duplicate systems for everything. 2 boilers, backup electrical systems, redundant everything. The engineer in him couldn't stand the thought of a single point of failure. If one system broke down, another would immediately kick in. He applied industrial efficiency to domestic life, and the result was probably the most technologically advanced private home in America. The garden deserves its own chapter in this story. Richard Schermerhorn Jr. designed a private paradise that covered the southern portion of the property. But Carnegie didn't just plant some flowers and call it a day. In April 1901, the New York Large Tree Company began delivering around 30 mature trees to the site. Full-grown trees, some measuring up to 60 feet tall and 17 inches in diameter. The New York Times devoted multiple articles to this horticultural engineering feat, describing how massive trees were dug up and transplanted to Carnegie's property. There was a stone and timber pergola where you could sit and enjoy views of the entire garden. Elaborate cast-iron fencing with granite walls and piers topped with stylized acorns and urns enclosed everything. One of the few private enclosed green spaces in Manhattan. The Carnegies moved in on December 12, 1902. Andrew wrote to friends describing how happy he was, how the house was exactly what he'd hoped for. Louise noted in her diary that she was very pleased with the house, though she'd been the one actually making most of the design decisions while Andrew obsessed over the mechanical systems. Their daughter Margaret, just 5 years old, would grow up in these grand rooms, playing in a garden that most Manhattan children could only dream of. But what Carnegie didn't realise was that he'd just validated a neighbourhood. Other industrial titans watched where he built and followed him north. Thomas F. Ryan constructed a mansion nearby. James B. A. Haggin did the same. William B. Leeds, Daniel G. Reed, all the big names. Henry Clay Frick, Carnegie's former business partner, turned bitter rival, built his own palace specifically to compete with Carnegie's mansion. The two men had fallen out spectacularly over the Homestead Strike of 1892, and their rivalry extended to their architectural ambitions. Frick wanted to make sure his house was just as impressive, just as grand, a constant reminder that he was Carnegie's equal. The New York World wrote in 1912 that Andrew Carnegie's palace marked the northern boundary of fashion's realm. Carnegie had single-handedly pushed that boundary upward by 40 blocks. The area became known as Carnegie Hill, a name it still carries today. Property values in the neighbourhood exploded. The New York Sun reported that Carnegie's 1898 land purchase had caused prices of vacant property nearby to skyrocket. Carnegie had created exactly what he wanted, an exclusive enclave where he controlled the character and quality of development. But the mansion wasn't just for showing off. Carnegie used it as his headquarters for systematic philanthropy. From his private office, he orchestrated the distribution of roughly $350 million of his personal fortune. He funded over 1,500 public libraries across America and Britain. He created universities and research institutions. He built concert halls. The man gave money away with the same industrial efficiency he'd used to make it. The staff required to run this place was substantial. Housekeepers, cooks, gardeners, maintenance workers for the complex technical systems, personal servants for the family. One particularly dedicated employee, Martha Clark, was born in Dundee, Scotland, and started working for the Carnegies at their Skibo Castle when she was 16, around 1911. She made the regular journeys between New York and Scotland with the family for years, a living connection between Carnegie's two worlds. When the mansion was fully staffed and operational, when the organ filled the main hall with music and the dining room seated dozens of powerful guests discussing the future of America, it was as grand as any palace in the country. Carnegie might have called it modest, but when those lights came on and those doors opened for society events, nobody was fooled. This was power and wealth on an epic scale. But building a house specifically tailored to one person's needs, equipped with technology requiring constant specialized maintenance and a massive staff, works great while that person is alive and paying for it. Once they're gone, you're left with a beautiful white elephant that nobody quite knows what to do with. And that countdown had already started. The philanthropist's last years. Andrew Carnegie didn't just collect money. He wasn't like the other robber barons who built their fortunes and sat on them like dragons on gold hoards. Carnegie had published an essay in 1889 called The Gospel of Wealth, arguing that rich people had a moral obligation to use their money to improve society. The wealthy were merely temporary trustees of their wealth, he believed, holding it briefly to distribute for the public good. And he meant it. From 1901, when he retired from active business after selling Carnegie Steel to J.P. Morgan for $480 million, until his death in 1919, Carnegie lived his philosophy. The mansion became mission control for what might be history's greatest act of systematic philanthropy. He'd meet with representatives from towns seeking library funding in one of his multiple libraries. He'd correspond with university presidents about establishing new institutions. He'd plan his next charitable venture while sitting in the conservatory, looking out over his garden. Carnegie held dinners for what he called the Knights of the Cloth, informal gatherings where he'd discuss philanthropy with other wealthy men. The organ concerts in the main hall became regular events. Louise Carnegie noted that he delighted in society, in conversations with interesting people, in the life of the mind. The mansion wasn't just a home, it was a salon, a meeting place, a centre of influence. Starting in 1911, Carnegie began allowing local children to play in his garden. The private paradise he'd created became semi-public, a gift to the neighbourhood. It was exactly the kind of gesture his gospel of wealth demanded. What good was a beautiful garden if only one family enjoyed it? But the world was changing in ways that threatened everything Carnegie had worked for. World War I broke out in 1914. The man who'd spent millions promoting international peace watched the world tear itself apart. The Carnegies could no longer make their annual summer trips to Skibo Castle in Scotland. They bought a summer house in Massachusetts instead, but it wasn't the same. Shadowbrook, as the Massachusetts estate was called, became their summer retreat, but Scotland remained in their hearts. In 1915, an anarchist tried to bomb the Carnegie mansion. The attempt failed, but it drove home an uncomfortable truth. Carnegie's wealth and prominence made him a target. The labour disputes, the strikes, the violence at Homestead that had destroyed his friendship with Frick, these things created enemies who wanted to hurt him. The mansion needed security, protection, constant vigilance. Carnegie bought a wooden shack in 1917 on the southeast corner of 5th Avenue and 90th Street. Not because he wanted it, he bought it specifically to prevent developers from erecting an apartment building that would block his view and lower property values. He'd pay good money for an eyesore just to keep it from becoming something worse. That's how seriously he took control of his neighborhood. On April 22, 1919, Margaret Carnegie married Roswell Miller at the mansion. It was a grand society wedding, exactly the kind of event the house had been designed to host. Over 100 guests attended the noon ceremony. Walter Gale played the wedding march on the organ. The main floor was decorated with hundreds of fresh flowers. Margaret wore white satin and lace, and coincidentally, it was Andrew and Louise's 32nd wedding anniversary. The house witnessed what might have been its happiest moment, a celebration of family and love and new beginnings. Just months later, on August 11, 1919, Andrew Carnegie died of bronchial pneumonia at Shadowbrook. He was 83 years old. He'd given away $350,695,653 during his lifetime, roughly 90% of his fortune. His last $30 million went to foundations and charities after his death. The man had practiced what he preached, systematically distributing nearly everything he'd made. Carnegie left the mansion to Louise. In his will, he also left sizable amounts to his butler, housekeeper, nurse, and oldest servant, noting that these four were as members of his family. The gesture was pure Carnegie, remembering the people who'd actually made his life comfortable. The mansion was valued at just under $1 million when Carnegie died, equivalent to about $15 million in today's money. But that valuation didn't account for the real cost, maintaining it. The complex heating system required specialized staff. The elevators needed constant maintenance. The extensive gardens required professional gardeners. The house needed a full complement of servants just to keep it running. And Louise Carnegie, while certainly wealthy enough to afford it, was suddenly living alone in a 64-room mansion designed for entertaining on a grand scale, the Widow's Vigil. Louise Carnegie kept the mansion exactly as her husband had left it. For 27 years after Andrew's death, she lived in that enormous house, maintaining it as a shrine to his memory. The organ that Andrew had loved continued to fill the main hall with music until 1946, when Louise died. She held organ concerts, inviting musicians to play for audiences just as Andrew had done. She entertained her grandchildren in the garden that Andrew had so carefully designed. She hosted occasional benefits and social events, keeping up the traditions her husband had established. In the early 1920s, the mansion was physically connected to the townhouse at 9 East 91st Street. Margaret and her husband, Roswell Miller, lived there with their growing family starting in 1920. Mother and daughter maintained separate households in connected buildings, a practical arrangement that kept the family close while giving each their independence. Margaret would live at 9 East 91st Street until 1948, long after her mother's death. But maintaining that house grew harder every year. The technology that had been cutting edge in 1902 was outdated by the 1920s. The systems needed constant repairs. Finding people who understood how Carnegie's redundant mechanical systems worked became increasingly difficult. The house was from another era, designed for a way of life that was rapidly disappearing. The Gilded Age was over. The robber barons were dying off. The massive Fifth Avenue mansions that had symbolized American wealth and industrial power were becoming expensive anachronisms. Many were being torn down, replaced with apartment buildings that could generate steady rental income. Others were being converted into institutions, hotels, office buildings, anything that could justify the operating costs. Louise maintained a skeleton staff under the supervision of the family steward, Alexander Morrison. But as she aged and her needs became simpler, whole wings of the house sat unused. the ballroom Carnegie had specifically instructed the architects not to include, well, his other entertaining spaces sat largely empty. The multiple libraries gathered dust. The conservatory, that beautiful glass structure where Carnegie had spent so many hours, required expensive maintenance for plants nobody was looking at anymore. Louise Carnegie died on June 24, 1946, at the age of 89. Her daughter Margaret was by her bedside. Louise left the mansion to the Carnegie Corporation of New York, the philanthropic foundation Andrew had established. And immediately, the Carnegie Corporation faced a problem that would haunt the building for the next 3 decades. They didn't need it. They had no use for a 64-room mansion, no matter how historically significant or technologically advanced. They couldn't justify the expense of maintaining it, but they also couldn't just abandon it or let it fall apart. This was Andrew Carnegie's home, the place from which he'd orchestrated one of history's greatest acts of philanthropy. It deserved better than the wrecking ball. But what exactly should they do with it? The mansion sat largely empty after Louise's death, maintained by Morrison and a skeleton crew. It remained largely intact, frozen in time, a monument to a world that no longer existed. The Carnegie Corporation tried to figure out what to do with this very expensive problem they'd inherited. And their first solution seemed perfect on paper: the unwanted palace. In late 1946, just months after Louise Carnegie's death, the Carnegie Corporation made the mansion an offer it thought the world couldn't refuse. They approached the United Nations, which had just been founded and desperately needed space in New York City, with a proposal. The mansion could serve as their clubhouse and office space. The UN Secretariat could occupy the building. There would be club rooms for delegates. It seemed ideal. A building dedicated to peace and philanthropy becoming headquarters for an organization dedicated to international cooperation. Andrew Carnegie would have approved. The proposal went through the usual channels. The UN sent people to inspect the space. Discussions happened, committees met. But as the months dragged on, it became clear the deal wasn't happening. The mansion, for all its grandeur, wasn't quite right for the UN's needs. The location was too far uptown. The building layout didn't work for their purposes. They needed something purpose-built, not adapted from a private residence. As late as 1948, 2 full years after Louise Carnegie's death, the Carnegie Corporation was still trying to work out details of leasing the house to the UN. But ultimately, the deal fell through. The United Nations decided to build their headquarters elsewhere, on land donated by John D. Rockefeller Jr. On the east side of Manhattan. The mansion remained empty. Well, not entirely empty. The personal parcel service, which shipped food packages around the world, occupied the first-floor art gallery room in the late 1940s. It was a far cry from the grand entertaining space Carnegie had envisioned, but at least someone was using the building for something. At least the lights were on, and people were walking through those halls. Finally, in January 1949, the Carnegie Corporation found what seemed like a sustainable solution. They agreed to lease both the Carnegie Mansion and Margaret's adjacent townhouse to Columbia University's School of Social Work for 21 years, with an option to renew. The lease began that year, and suddenly the mansion had a purpose again. The School of Social Work moved in and adapted the space as best they could. Bedrooms became classrooms. The grand reception rooms transformed into lecture halls. The conservatory and garden became places where students could relax between classes, study in the sunshine, escape the intensity of their work. Libraries that had held Carnegie's personal collection now housed social work texts and research materials. For nearly 2 decades, social work students attended classes in rooms where robber barons had once plotted business deals. They studied poverty and inequality in spaces built from steel profits. They learned about helping the underprivileged in a mansion that represented the heights of privilege. The irony was almost too perfect. Columbia made it work, but it was never quite right. The mansion's layout didn't suit institutional use. The ornate decorations and historical details required careful maintenance, limiting what modifications Columbia could make. The heating system, that marvel of 1902 engineering, was expensive to operate and difficult to repair. The mansion was a beautiful space for education, but it was fundamentally designed for something else. And Columbia knew it. The university was growing rapidly, and the mansion's location on the Upper East Side was increasingly inconvenient for their needs. As the lease approached its end in the late 1960s, Columbia made it clear they weren't going to renew. They announced they'd be leaving the mansion when the lease expired. The university had appreciated the space, had made good use of it, but ultimately it wasn't sustainable for their purposes. The Carnegie Corporation faced their problem all over again. The mansion was once more homeless, once more without purpose. The building that had cost nearly $1 million to build, that represented cutting-edge engineering and design, that had hosted some of the most important philanthropic work in American history, was about to become vacant again. And this time, the building faced a threat far more serious than just sitting empty: the death sentence. The year was 1966, and the Carnegie Mansion received both an honor and a potential death sentence. It was designated a National Historic Landmark, one of the highest recognitions a building can receive in the United States. The designation acknowledged the mansion's architectural significance, its role in American history, its importance as Andrew Carnegie's home and the headquarters of his philanthropic empire. But here's what most people don't understand about landmark designations in 1966. They were basically fancy certificates that said, "This building is important," without actually protecting the building from anything. The designation carried prestige but no legal protection, at least not the kind that could stop a determined owner from doing whatever they wanted with their property. Being named a National Historic Landmark was an honor. It was not a shield. And New York City in the mid-1960s was in the middle of a demolition fever that bordered on mania. The city was eating itself, tearing down its own history to make way for the future. Penn Station had been demolished in 1963, sparking massive public outrage that came too late to save it. That gorgeous Beaux-Arts masterpiece, that cathedral to transportation, reduced to rubble so Madison Square Garden could rise in its place. The loss of Penn Station woke New Yorkers up to what they were losing, but the wrecking balls kept swinging. Grand old hotels were falling. Mansions that had seemed like permanent fixtures of the cityscape were making way for apartment towers and office buildings. The economics were brutally simple. An entire city block occupied by one old building, even a historically significant one, could instead house dozens or hundreds of luxury apartments generating ongoing rental income. From a pure financial standpoint, keeping these old mansions made no sense at all. The Carnegie Mansion was in real danger. Columbia University was leaving. The Carnegie Corporation didn't want to maintain it themselves. The building was expensive to operate, technically complex, designed for a way of life that no longer existed. The rational, practical, financially sound decision would have been to sell the property to developers, take the substantial profit, and let them build something that actually made economic sense. Developers were very interested. The location was premium real estate, 5th Avenue and 91st Street, a massive lot in one of Manhattan's most desirable neighborhoods. You could fit a significant apartment complex on that footprint. The mansion would have to go, but that was just progress. That's how cities evolved. Old things made way for new things. That was the natural order. The preservation community watched with growing dread. They'd already lost Penn Station. They couldn't bear to lose another piece of New York's history, especially one as significant as the Carnegie Mansion. But what could they do? The building had no protected status beyond its National Historic Landmark designation, which was essentially meaningless. It was a certificate, a plaque, a note in the history books. It wouldn't stop a wrecking ball. Preservationists feared the mansion would follow the path of other great Fifth Avenue residences. The Cornelius Vanderbilt II mansion, once the largest private residence in New York, had been demolished in 1926. The A.T. Stewart mansion, gone. The William Keesum Vanderbilt mansion, torn down. Most devastating of all, the Charles M. Schwab mansion on Riverside Drive, demolished in 1948 to make way for apartment buildings, despite being one of the most spectacular private residences ever built in America. Schwab's mansion had been even larger than Carnegie's, with over 75 rooms, its own bowling alley, a pool, a gymnasium, a private power plant. None of that mattered when the economics no longer made sense. The mansion came down, and luxury apartments went up in its place. If Schwab's palace couldn't survive, what chance did Carnegie's supposedly modest house have? As Columbia prepared to depart and the Carnegie Corporation weighed their options, the mansion's fate hung in the balance. The preservation community braced for the worst. And then something completely unexpected happened. Actually, two completely unexpected things happened at almost exactly the same time, in two different parts of New York City, and their intersection would save the Carnegie Mansion from destruction through what can only be described as an improbable miracle of timing: the Downtown Museum. To understand how the Carnegie Mansion was saved, we need to go back to 1895 and downtown to Greenwich Village. That's where Sarah Cooper Hewitt and Eleanor Garnier Hewitt, granddaughters of the industrialist Peter Cooper, returned from a European tour with a problem and a vision. The Hewitt sisters had been travelling through Europe, visiting museums in London, Paris, and Vienna. They'd fallen in love with the decorative arts museums they encountered, institutions dedicated to collecting and displaying furniture, textiles, ceramics, wallpaper, metalwork, all the designed objects that made life beautiful and functional. These museums preserved design history and used it to educate the public about craftsmanship and aesthetics. The Hewitt sisters thought America desperately needed something similar. In 1895, they approached the Cooper Union for the Advancement of Science and Art, the institution their grandfather, Peter Cooper, had founded, with a proposal. Could they establish a museum for the arts of decoration in the Cooper Union building? The institution agreed, and in 1897, the Cooper Union Museum officially opened its doors. The Hewitt sisters funded the museum themselves initially, donating their own collections and actively acquiring new pieces. Sarah Hewitt donated a significant lace collection. Other donors contributed pieces from the Palace of Fontainebleau, decorative fountains, various art objects. The museum grew slowly but steadily in the Cooper Union's foundation building at Lexington Avenue and 22nd Street, downtown in the Village. Now here's where this connects to Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie and Peter Cooper knew each other. They'd moved in the same philanthropic circles, shared similar values about using wealth to improve society. Carnegie served on the Cooper Union Museum's advisory council. He made generous donations to the institution. The Carnegies and the Hewitts were social acquaintances who understood each other's missions. The Hewitt sisters managed the museum until 1930, when a board of directors was appointed to oversee operations. In 1938, the museum was incorporated directly under Cooper Union, with an advisory board helping manage it. For decades, it operated in its original downtown location, slowly accumulating one of the finest collections of decorative arts and design objects in America. But by the early 1960s, Cooper Union was struggling financially. The college faced difficult budget pressures and had to make hard decisions about which programs to maintain and which to cut. In 1963, they made an announcement that shocked the design world and the preservation community. They were going to abolish the Cooper Union Museum, just close it down, disperse the collection, end the whole operation. The reaction was immediate and furious. 260 people rallied together within days and formed the committee to save the Cooper Union Museum. This wasn't just random concerned citizens waving signs. This was serious people with serious connections. Henry F. DuPont, the famous horticulturist and decorative arts collector, led the committee. These people had resources, expertise, and determination. They fought for 5 years through protracted legal proceedings. Their argument was straightforward and compelling. This collection was too important to lose. It represented decades of careful acquisition and study. It was genuinely unique among American museums. Allowing it to be dispersed or destroyed would be an act of cultural vandalism that the city would regret forever. At the same time this battle was raging, the Smithsonian Institution in Washington was looking to expand beyond its traditional boundaries. The Smithsonian had always been concentrated in Washington, but they were interested in establishing a presence in New York City. And they were particularly interested in design, an area where they didn't have strong coverage in their existing museums. In 1967, the Smithsonian and Cooper Union reached an agreement that satisfied everyone. The Smithsonian would take over the Cooper Union Museum's collection and ensure its survival. The museum would remain in New York City permanently, honouring the Hewitt sisters' original vision. And it would become part of the Smithsonian family of museums, gaining stability and resources it had never had before. On October 9, 1967, Smithsonian Secretary S. Dillon Ripley and Daniel Magin, chair of Cooper Union's Board of Trustees, signed the agreement. The museum was officially transferred to the Smithsonian on July 1, 1968, becoming the Cooper Hewitt Museum of Design. It was the first Smithsonian museum located outside of Washington, a significant expansion of the institution's reach. But the Smithsonian had inherited a serious problem along with this valuable collection. The Cooper Union space was tiny, nowhere near adequate for the collection, let alone room for growth or proper exhibitions. The Smithsonian needed to find a new home for their newest acquisition. They needed something in New York City, something substantial, something with the kind of space and gravitas appropriate for a Smithsonian museum. They needed a mansion, a big one, with gallery space and gardens and historical significance. They needed, in other words, exactly the kind of building that the Carnegie Corporation was desperately trying to figure out what to do with. The perfect match. Think about the timing here. Columbia University announced it would be leaving the Carnegie Mansion in the mid-1960s. Cooper Union announced it was disbanding its museum around the same time. The Smithsonian took over the Cooper Union Museum in 1967 and immediately started looking for a New York location. The Carnegie Corporation was looking for someone, anyone, who could use their very expensive white elephant. And the American Alliance of Museums, watching all this unfold, realized they could solve multiple problems at once. The alliance played matchmaker, bringing together the Smithsonian and the Carnegie Corporation. By 1969, serious negotiations were underway. Think about the beautiful symmetry of what was happening. Andrew Carnegie and Peter Cooper had known each other. They'd moved in the same circles, shared the same values about philanthropy and education. Carnegie had supported Cooper's museum during his lifetime, and now, decades after both men's deaths, Carnegie's mansion would become the home for the museum founded by Cooper's granddaughters. It was almost too perfect. The mansion that had been built to house Carnegie's philanthropic work would now house a museum dedicated to design and decorative arts. The building that had been a burden, an expensive problem nobody wanted, would become a cherished institution. The White Elephant would become a beloved landmark. In 1972, the Carnegie Corporation formally gifted the mansion and the adjacent townhouse at 9 East 91st Street to the Smithsonian Institution. Not leased, not sold, gifted. It was an extraordinary act of philanthropy in its own right, worth millions of dollars. But the Carnegie Corporation believed this was the right use for Andrew Carnegie's home, the use that would honour his legacy and his values. The mansion needed extensive renovations to transform from a private residence and later a school into a proper museum. The architectural firm Hardy Holtzman Pfeiffer Associates was hired to oversee the conversion. They faced a delicate challenge that would test their skills and patience. They had to modernise the building for museum use while preserving its historical character and architectural significance. Too much modernisation would destroy what made the building special. Too little would leave it unsuitable for its new purpose. The work took 4 years and required careful planning. They needed climate control systems appropriate for preserving delicate textiles and works on paper. They had to create proper gallery spaces with appropriate lighting that wouldn't damage the objects on display. They needed to make the building accessible to the public, adding elements like public restrooms, visitor services areas, a gift shop, all the infrastructure a private mansion would never need. And they had to do all of this while respecting the historic fabric of the building, preserving the features that made it architecturally significant. The oak panelling in the main hall had to be preserved. The stained glass attributed to Louis Comfort Tiffany had to be protected. The elaborate plaster decorations in the reception room, the carved corbels in the teak room, all the details that made this mansion special had to remain intact while the building transformed around them. On October 7, 1976, the Cooper Hewitt Museum officially opened its doors in the Carnegie Mansion. For the first time in 74 years, the public could walk through Andrew Carnegie's home. Regular people, not just the wealthy and powerful, could climb that grand staircase, walk through those reception rooms, see the spaces where one of America's most famous industrialists had lived and worked and given away his fortune. The first and second floors became exhibition spaces. The third floor housed the museum's extensive library. The conservatory and garden remained, offering visitors a rare green oasis in the middle of Manhattan. The organ was gone, moved to the Nassau Center for the Fine Arts in 1974, but the space where it had stood still resonated with the memory of those concerts Carnegie had loved. The mansion had found its purpose at last, not as a private home, not as a school, as a public institution dedicated to design and decorative arts, open to anyone who wanted to visit, funded by the Smithsonian, protected from the threats of demolition and neglect that had haunted it for decades. But the story doesn't end there, because maintaining a 19th century mansion as a 21st century museum is expensive, complex, and never truly finished. The challenges of running a museum in such a building would test the institution repeatedly over the coming decades. The never-ending renovation. Operating a museum in the Carnegie Mansion meant constant compromise. The building was beautiful and historically significant, but it was fundamentally designed for a different purpose. Converting a private home into a public museum meant dealing with problems that normal museums didn't face. The gallery spaces were oddly shaped because they'd originally been drawing rooms and bedrooms, not exhibition halls. The windows that had provided lovely natural light for the Carnegies made it extremely difficult to control lighting conditions for preserving delicate textiles and works on paper. Every historical feature that made the building architecturally significant also made it expensive to maintain and nearly impossible to modify without destroying its character. The museum acquired the townhouse at 11 East 91st Street in 1989, giving them additional space. But it was becoming increasingly clear that more significant work would be needed. The building systems that had been cutting edge in 1902 were now nearly a century old and failing. The gallery spaces weren't adequate for the museum's growing collection and ambitions. In 1995, the museum closed for a $20 million renovation. They upgraded mechanical systems, improved gallery spaces, added better visitor amenities. The museum reopened in 1996, and for a while, it seemed like the problems had been solved. But even $20 million wasn't enough. By 2008, it was clear the mansion needed more extensive work, much more extensive. The museum launched another renovation project, and this time the price tag was staggering, $91 million. The museum would close for 3 years, from December 2011 to December 2014, for the most comprehensive renovation in its history. This wasn't just repairs and updates. This was a fundamental reimagining of what the museum could be. They hired multiple architecture firms to work on different aspects. Gluckman Manor Architects handled the interior renovation. Buyer Blinder Bell oversaw the engineering and historic preservation, making sure that modernisation didn't destroy historical integrity. Hood Design Studio redesigned the garden, updating the 1901 design for 21st century use. Dilla Scofidio plus Renfro created innovative display systems and interactive elements that would make the museum engaging for contemporary visitors. The renovation restored key features to their original grandeur while adding cutting-edge museum technology. They increased exhibition space from about 10,000 square feet to 17,000 square feet, including a new 6,000 square foot gallery. They installed interactive creative technologies that let visitors engage with design in completely new ways. They created a special pen that visitors could use to save objects they were interested in for later exploration, blending digital technology with physical space. The renovated museum reopened on December 12, 2014, exactly 112 years after Andrew and Louise Carnegie had first moved into their new home. The opening was celebrated with exhibitions, events, and press coverage that highlighted how the mansion had been transformed into a 21st century institution while respecting the Victorian mansion that housed it. The project achieved LEED Silver certification, optimizing the mansion's energy performance and implementing sustainable practices. They purchased green certified electrical supply, reduced water use, improved insulation, made dozens of enhancements. But making a 19th century mansion energy efficient is like teaching an old dog new tricks. The building was designed for an era when energy was cheap and environmental impact wasn't a consideration. The steel frame that had been revolutionary in 1902 now required specialized maintenance. The decorative elements needed careful preservation. The garden needed perpetual care. Every renovation, no matter how extensive, was just buying time until the next one, because old buildings, especially ones as complex as the Carnegie Mansion, never stopped needing work. The irony of survival. Today, the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum continues to operate in the Carnegie Mansion. It's the only museum in the United States devoted exclusively to historic and contemporary design. It hosts exhibitions, runs educational programs, maintains one of the world's finest collections of design objects. Visitors come from around the world to see both the collection and the building that houses it. But it's worth remembering what this building actually is. It's a museum operating in a structure that was never meant to be a museum, a private palace that became an institution, a steel magnate's dream home that found its purpose only after his death and only through an improbable series of coincidences. When Andrew Carnegie built his mansion in 1902, he thought he was creating a family home, a place where he could live comfortably with Louise and Margaret, a garden where children could play, an office from which he could oversee his philanthropic work. He got all of that, but only for 17 years before pneumonia killed him at Shadowbrook. Louise tried to maintain it as a home for another 27 years, but increasingly it must have felt like living in a museum. Whole wings sitting unused, complex systems requiring constant expensive maintenance, a house designed for grand entertaining, occupied by one elderly woman and her memories. After Louise died, the building spent decades searching for a purpose. United Nations headquarters? Didn't work out. University building? Temporary at best. And finally, improbably, a museum founded by the granddaughters of Carnegie's friend and fellow philanthropist. A use that made sense, honoured the building's history, and justified its continued existence. The mansion stands today as a monument to several different things simultaneously. It's a monument to Carnegie's wealth and his particular vision of what wealth should be used for. It's a testament to early 20th century technological innovation, with its steel frame and sophisticated mechanical systems. It's an example of how the Gilded Age's grandest residences struggled to find relevance in the modern world. But more than anything, it's a reminder that buildings have lives beyond their creators' intentions. Carnegie built a home. It became a school. Then it became a museum. Each transformation required compromise, adaptation, enormous expense, and each transformation represented someone deciding that this building, this particular collection of steel and stone and gardens, was worth saving. Not all of Carnegie's fellow robber barons were so lucky. The Vanderbilt mansions, demolished. The Stuart mansion, gone. The Schwab Palace, reduced to rubble. One by one, the grand palaces of Fifth Avenue's Millionaires' Row fell to the wrecking ball, replaced by apartment buildings that generated income rather than draining resources. The Carnegie Mansion survived, but not because it was inherently more worthy or beautiful than those others. It survived because of timing, because the Smithsonian needed a New York location for a design museum at exactly the moment when the Carnegie Corporation needed someone to take an expensive building off their hands, because enough people believed it was worth the enormous expense and effort to save it. There's irony in the fact that Carnegie's mansion now houses a museum dedicated to design. Carnegie wasn't particularly interested in design for design's sake. He wanted functionality, efficiency, the latest technology. His mansion was innovative not because of its aesthetics, but because of its engineering. The steel frame, the elevators, the climate control systems, these were what excited Carnegie, not the Louis XV drawing room or the carved Scottish thistles. Yet, somehow, it's fitting. The Cooper Hewitt's mission to advance public understanding of design across centuries of human creativity aligns with Carnegie's own philosophy about wealth and education. He believed the rich should use their resources to benefit society, to educate, to elevate. And that's exactly what his mansion does now, just not in the way he ever imagined. The garden still exists, though it's been redesigned multiple times. The steel frame still stands, though it requires constant expensive maintenance. The grand staircase still welcomes visitors, though now they're museum guests instead of dinner party attendees. The building continues its work, just different work than Carnegie envisioned. That might be the real lesson of the Carnegie Mansion. Buildings designed for one purpose often end up serving entirely different ones. The key to survival isn't being perfect for your original use. It's being adaptable enough to find new uses when the old ones become obsolete, and being valuable enough that people keep investing in your preservation. Carnegie wanted the most modest, plainest, and most roomy house in New York. He got a technological marvel that was too expensive for anyone to maintain as a private home after his death. But it found a second life, a third life, as many lives as it needed to justify its continued existence. The mansion sits on Fifth Avenue today, still anchoring Carnegie Hill, still maintaining its garden, still welcoming visitors. But they're visitors to a museum, not guests to a private home. They come to learn about design, not to dine with robber barons, They walk through spaces carefully preserved and climate-controlled, not rooms actively lived in. The Carnegie Mansion is a survivor. It survived Andrew Carnegie's death, Louise Carnegie's decades of widowhood, institutional neglect, Columbia University's departure, the very real threat of demolition, and multiple expensive transformations. It survived by being valuable enough to save and adaptable enough to serve new purposes. But it's also a cautionary tale. Carnegie built a house so specific to his needs, so technologically complex, and so expensive to maintain that within decades of his death, nobody knew what to do with it. If not for a series of fortunate coincidences, if the timing had been slightly different, if the Smithsonian hadn't needed a New York location exactly when Columbia left, the mansion almost certainly would have been demolished. The Steel Palace found its purpose, but it took half a century and multiple near misses with the wrecking ball to get there. It only survived because enough people decided it was worth the enormous expense and effort to save it. That's both its triumph and its tragedy. The downfall of the Carnegie Mansion wasn't physical demolition. It was obsolescence, irrelevance, being a magnificent building that nobody needed for decades. The downfall was being too grand for a private home, but not quite right for anything else. Too expensive to maintain, but too important to destroy. Too specific to Carnegie's vision, but adaptable enough to eventually find a new purpose. Until, improbably, impossibly, it did. And now it stands as one of New York's great museums, hosting visitors who marvel at both the collection inside and the building that contains it. A steel palace that finally found its purpose, even if it took 74 years and a series of fortunate coincidences to get there. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.